All right, everybody. Hey, how's it going? Welcome to the show. I'm Scott Horton. This is The Future of Freedom. Here every Thursday night on Liberty.me. And I interview him, Jacob Hornberger, founder and president of the Future Freedom Foundation and publisher of their monthly journal, The Future of Freedom. Welcome back. How are you doing, Jacob?
Doing great. Good to be back with you for another round, Scott.
Well, happy to be talking with you again. And, well, a couple important articles to talk about today, but I don't know, maybe just this one. I really like it. NYT, that is New York Times, doubles down on Ben Carson and Nazi Germany. And this is something that we talked about somewhat last week about gun control in the Third Reich and the disarming of Jews before the Holocaust and that kind of thing. But so now they've run another. And surprise, surprise, you got a problem with this one too. What's the big deal?
Yeah, first of all, let me tell everyone about a fantastic article. We're going to be linking to it tomorrow in our daily publication. It's called FFF Daily. In fact, if people are not subscribing to it, I'd highly recommend it. We carefully prepared. It's a publication that consists of 10 solid libertarian type articles, and we carefully research them and send them out every morning. And in tomorrow's issue is going to be a fantastic article by Stephen Holbrook, who's I guess the most renowned expert on gun rights and the Second Amendment around. And his article addresses this point that I was addressing in my initial article as to what impact gun rights and gun control had in Nazi Germany, and how it really would have impacted the outcome in the Holocaust. So I recommend everybody to take a look at that. It'll be on our website, our homepage tomorrow, or you can just Google Stephen Holbrook and what's Investors Business Daily. It's a fantastic article.
Well, in fact, he wrote a book about that. He wrote a book called Gun Control in the Third Reich, which I actually have here in my pile. You can see my pile of books I'm supposed to get to someday back there.
Yeah, if there's anybody an expert in this area, it's Holbrook. And in fact, I got criticized in an email today by another guy that said, oh no, the reason that Hitler didn't attack Switzerland was that he wanted the banks there to be independent because that's where they were socking away all their gold and so forth. Well, I recommended to him to go read Holbrook's book, Target Switzerland, which directly contradicts that. The reason that Hitler really desired to attack Switzerland. Switzerland was in between him and Italy, and of course he and Hitler and Mussolini had combined in an alliance. So there's nothing they wanted more than to be able to travel freely, send troops through Switzerland. And since Switzerland was neutral, it wouldn't permit such a transportation of troops. So Hitler really wanted to attack Switzerland, and his advisor said, "Look, you might win. It's possible, but you're going to pay such an enormous price because, as most people know, the Swiss people everybody's armed, and not only that, everybody knows how to use their weapon. I mean, everybody's got assault weapons in their home. In World War II, everybody knew where their duty station was to be immediately in the event of a German invasion, and they had all these kind of obstructions and plans to blow up tunnels and bridges and roads and so forth. So if it would have been a Pyrrhic victory if Hitler had won, and that was why he didn't invade Switzerland, because of their widespread gun ownership and their willingness to fight to the death if the guy had invaded. So it's another classic example of where gun ownership among the citizenry can not only protect you from internal tyranny, but from actually external tyranny as well. All right, so the New York Times doubles down.
Come to think of it, maybe we don't even need a standing army at all, since we got 300 million privately owned firearms for 300 million Americans.
Well, we really don't need a standing army. In fact, the standing army is your greatest threat to freedom. And this is what our founding fathers understood. This is why there was no standing army. Now, there was obviously a basic military force, but when we talk about standing armies, we're talking about an enormous, permanent, professional army like we have today that never goes away. Even when, at the end of World War II, it just didn't go away. And you say Eisenhower called it the military-industrial complex, and of course we throw into that the the paramilitary, the CIA, and then, of course, the NSA is part of this thing. But yeah, the last thing we need in this country today is a standing army. Think about it, Scott. What nation state has the ability, the military capacity to invade and conquer the United States?
None.
I mean, nobody. I mean, Russia, yeah, right.
Not only that, but even if they were magic, we don't really have any enemy states that we have to deal with. Assuming, you know, the aliens came to ally with them. We still really don't have any enemies. The worst you could find would be Russia and China, and we're more or less friends with them in most ways, really.
Well, and we could be friends with them. I mean, we keep provoking these crises like that, what NATO has done in Ukraine and what NATO's and the U.S. are now doing in the South China Sea. So, you know, you can have peaceful coexistence with regimes when you've got limited government, because if you don't have the ability to go out and provoke crises and invade countries and do regime change operations and give foreign aid to dictators, then you've got a government that's very weak and essentially impotent. And where the real power comes in is among the citizenry, what we call the nation, where the nation is strong because there's all this economic prosperity and capital development and so forth, and the government's very weak. Now, ironically, that kind of society is your strongest in war because you've got all these industries built up in the private sector that can be then converted over to wartime use if it comes to that. But a standing army absolutely weakens a country. I mean, we've learned that in history with the British Empire, the Soviet Empire, the Roman Empire. It's a huge drain on society. So, yeah, who's going to invade the United States anytime soon? I mean, nobody's got that military capability, and this is what Americans just don't get. They've been so inculcated with fear and fear of the communists, fear of the illegal aliens, fear of the drug dealers, fear of the terrorists, that they can't conceive of how impossible it is for any nation state to cross either the Atlantic or the Pacific. You'd need millions of troops. You'd need hundreds of thousands of transport ships and planes. Nobody's got that kind of money, much less the armaments and the manpower to do it. So now is the time. We should have done it at the end of the Cold War. We really should have never had a standing army, especially after World War II. So it was a big mistake, and I've said that before. But now is the time to dismantle this thing instead of, oh, well, let's have a 10% reduction in the Pentagon's rate of increase in spending, or let's kind of rein in the CIA a bit and have some hearings on them. No. Dismantle this entire warfare state, because that, Scott, is an essential prerequisite for a free society, and that's what we libertarians are all about, a free society, right?
Yep. Well, and I like how you always joke that, oh, yeah, no, the terrorists or the communists, where they're going to come to our country and take over our murderous local sheriff's department, our IRS, our, you know, whatever regulatory agencies and whatever. And next thing you know, then we won't even live in a free country anymore once these other people come and take over this greatest government ever created in the history of all of mankind that we're suffering under now. And so now that gets us back to Hitler again and the era of National Socialism in the 1930s. The story went, and apparently this isn't just the BS they taught me in government school when I was a kid. This is what everybody thought at the time, was that freedom had failed. The reason that the world, that the industrial world was in Great Depression was, and the reason, I guess, for the First World War somehow was that people were free. And boy, did that not work. And what we really need is some strong leadership. Now, obviously, in Europe, you have, you know, communist and outright fascist and Nazi revolutions going on over there. The ultimate degree of totalitarianism, even not just authoritarianism. But in your article here, you really lump in FDR with Mussolini and Hitler and say, you're a National Socialist too. And, you know, the funny thing about that is if you're not from America and you hear the story of FDR, you might think, yeah, that guy was a fascist president for life. You know, no other president had dared to run for a third term, much less a fourth, and the degree of power that he exercised. But the way we learn it in school is that this had to be done. That, in fact, we would have had a communist or a fascist revolution if it wasn't for FDR. He saved capitalism by giving us a quasi-free market, et cetera, like that. And otherwise, the place would have, everything would have been even worse than before. And in fact, you, I believe last week, or maybe it was the week before, referred to Jules Archer and the plot against the White House. Yeah, the plot against the White House, where I guess it was the Morgan interests especially were trying to do a coup d'etat and hire Smedley Butler to overthrow FDR. So he must have been a hero then, if those were the bastards who were trying to get rid of him, Jacob. So how can you sit here and tell me that he's no different in kind than Adolf Hitler?
Yeah, it's really one of the greatest instances of the success of indoctrination, especially in the public government schools. I mean, it ranks right up there with, praise of troops, because all the people they're killing over there in the Middle East, it's to defend our freedom. And that if they weren't out there assassinating people and bombing people, we wouldn't be free anymore, and we wouldn't be at the ball games and so forth. I mean, it's really classic indoctrination, and that's what happened in 1929 when the stock market crashes. Look, Scott, think how many wealthy people lost fortunes in that. Think how much suffering there was. Imagine if the American people had figured out that the U.S. government was responsible for all those suicides where multimillionaires were jumping out of skyscrapers and so forth, and the massive suffering. I mean, there really could have been a revolution just with the anger. So they had to sell it as the failure of free enterprise. But as Milton Friedman, Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and other Murray Rothbard, the Austrians have pointed out, and the free market types like Friedman, really what happened was the failure of the Federal Reserve, which is not free enterprise. It's part of a governmental structure that involves socialist central planning of the monetary sphere. And the central bank had come into existence in 1913, along, by the way, with the income tax, federal income tax, IRS. And so they had manipulated the money supply through the 20s, and then they missed their targets, and they over-contracted, and that's what caused the stock market crash. Roosevelt comes in and says, oh, well, I'm going to implement a new system that's going to save America's free enterprise system, which was the exact opposite of free enterprise. It was a regulated society. It was a corporatist society economy. It was a socialist society as reflected by Social Security. I mean, this was the welfare state revolution, where the primary function of government became to take money from one group of people and give it to another group of people. There was the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was straight out of Benito Mussolini's playbook. I mean, it cartelized American businesses and industries where they could set their own wages and prices and set their own rules and regulations. Classic government business partnership. Social Security originated among German socialists. So there, as I pointed out in my article, there's this great book called Three New Deals by a guy named Shivelbush, very academic book that compares FDR's philosophy and program with that of Hitler and Mussolini. They were very similar in terms of how Hitler was bringing Germany out of the Depression and how Roosevelt was bringing America out of the Depression. In fact, what you'll never learn in public school is that Hitler actually sent Roosevelt a letter that says, I want to commend you on your program for getting America out of the Great Depression, that we're doing the same thing here in Germany. You believe, as we do, that the public weal triumphs over the individual self-interest. And if people don't want to buy the book, there's a great review of the book by David Bose of the Cato Institute, and online also David Gordon of the Mises Institute. So yeah, you have these similarities in philosophy that's going on in National Socialist Germany with the socialist programs, and then you've got Roosevelt who's implementing this program, Scott, and the Supreme Court is declaring much of it unconstitutional, including the National Industrial Recovery Act. Now, what are they saying when they say it's unconstitutional? They're saying this kind of program has no place in American society, not under our system of government as it was framed back in 1787, adopted in 1791. And so it's nullified under our form of government. So what does Roosevelt do? He does the exact type of thing that Hitler does. He says, well, I'm not going to put up with that. I'm not going to go through the hassle of a constitutional amendment, which is effectively what they were saying. If you want to change it, you got to go through the constitutional amendment. No, he comes up with this court packing scheme where he's going to pack the Supreme Court with additional justices that are his cronies. And so ironically, Hitler was doing the same thing. Hitler was really angry because some of the defendants in the Reichstag terrorist case had been acquitted by the German courts. So Hitler goes out and forms his own People's Court, which was this tribunal to cook up verdicts that he wanted in terrorism cases and treason cases. Well, so you've got this dictatorial environment in the 1930s that Americans just have never learned about, that Roosevelt was exercising powers of decree. He nationalized everybody's gold. Imagine that. That's no different from what Castro did in Cuba when he nationalized, people's property. I mean, here was the official money of the United States, gold and silver coins, 130 years or so. That was the official money under the Constitution. Roosevelt says, turn it in or I will come after you with a felony conviction. And he meant it, because they did go after people who were caught with, imagine, gold coins. And they made them felons. And then that's how we end up with the paper money and the Federal Reserve and the decades of debasement and so forth.
Good times. Well, so there's a great book by Burton Folsom called New Deal or Raw Deal, where he really goes to show how this is just democratic politics, the same as we know them right now. Hey, you want some money for your district, Mr. Congressman? Well, vote for our evil, inefficient, fascist scam, and we'll give you, pork barrel funds for your people. And that's it. Same as always. And the people who got the aid, it wasn't distributed by, say, I don't know, who was poorest and needed it the most or whatever. It was all about just rounding up Democratic votes and holding on to them. But now, so here's the thing, though. Two things. First of all, we got to get back to the coup. Well, if he was so great for the fascist businessmen on Wall Street, how come they wanted to overthrow him and create a fascist dictatorship if he already was one? But then the other thing is, how come he was elected 4 times? How come he was able to get blacks and whites, east and west, town and country, the whole damn country to come together and realign behind the Democratic Party and stay that way for 20 years?
Yeah, well, let me address your little sidebar there, though. I think it's very interesting what you said, because that really is what the American political system under the welfare warfare state. It's a system of bribery. It's political bribery, where politicians are bribing the electorate with goodies. And they're not the only ones that do it. In Latin America, it's standard that when a Latin American guy like Chavez or Maduro or something and is running during election time, he's handing out candy and goodies and so forth. Well, that's what American politicians do. They hand out public housing projects and grants and aid and all the kind of things to bribe the electorate. And so what ends up happening is you have a society like we have today, where everybody, as Frederick Bastiat, the great French free market legislator, said, the government's the fiction by which everyone is trying to live at the expense of everyone else. So everybody's trying to get his hand into everybody else's pocket, but at the same time, on April 15th, is doing his best to protect his own money from getting plundered. And so it's a system that engenders constant conflict, it's based on envy, covetousness, and it's a crooked, corrupt system that's really based on bribery. All right, so just to address your sidebar there. On the coup thing, I've heard about it, but I really don't have a good understanding of what happened in that. My impression, though, and I could be totally off base, you could educate me on this. My impression is that there were the military types, or the people that wanted the military to take over to save the country from what Roosevelt was doing. These were the conservatives who were still libertarians, who saw that Roosevelt was taking the country in a very bad direction, in a socialist, fascist direction, and said, hey, let's have a coup to save the country. Along the same lines that say the national security state ousted Allende from power in Chile. I mean, the idea was we got to remove a president from power in order to save the country, even though it's not constitutional. That's always been my impression of that coup, but I haven't read anything on it. And my impression also was that Smedley Butler was, and I could be wrong again, was the guy that helped stop that. Now, there's a great book on this that I'm getting ready to read. We discussed in the last couple of weeks, I think it was last week, David Talbot's new book on the national security state, Allen Dulles, and the JFK assassination. Fantastic book again. I just finished it. It's one of the best books I've ever read. It's one of the finest books on the indictment of both the national security state, and it's the role it played in the Kennedy assassination. But it turns out that Talbot's written a book on this subject, on this coup in the 30s, and I forget the name of it. But I'm getting ready. I already downloaded that on Kindle, bought it on Amazon. So I'll be able to discuss that more intelligently with you at a future date.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'd like to hear what you say about that. I read The Plot to Seize the White House by Jules Archer, but I read it in like 1997 or 1998. But my understanding is not so much that they conflated fascism and socialism and they were libertarians. They called him a socialist. They were fascists. They were right-wing, militarist, corporatist. You know, as we discussed before on the show, America has been a welfare state for the rich ever since Henry Clay and Alexander Hamilton and the American system back in the very beginning. And so they weren't upset that, you know, corporations were being cartelized and being put on welfare and given much more political power than they had before. What they were worried about was that poor people were getting power, that new people who didn't have political power before were having it extended to them. And they were going to be damned if that was going to happen on their watch. And so, not that I support, you know, Americans, the American masses buying into, you know, socialism for everybody, because I would rather be free. But their point wasn't, oh no, you know, we're being made more powerful by this dictator and we've got to stop it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, and that was really the fight in Chile. I mean, you had the fascists represented by Pinochet and the CIA and the Pentagon, and you had the socialists represented by Allende. So there's always this debate, like, well, who was right? Was it Allende or was it Pinochet? We libertarians, we don't get involved in deciding who's the better dictator, the socialist or the
our only
fascist.
point is that America was wrong in intervening there and doing the coup, of course.
Absolutely. America should have stayed out, and we should be here in this country establishing a free society as a model for Chile and Venezuela and all the rest of these countries. And in order to establish that model, we've got to dismantle the impediments to freedom, which
all right, but now, so get back to how it is that the American people bought into this.
Okay.
The American people bought into Barack Obama for about 6 months, you know, and they preferred him to Romney, right? But how the hell they buy into FDR and make him president for life?
Well, yeah, it's a fascinating question. I think it's because of the crisis environment. I mean, this is why, you know, I often hear people, free market types, saying, well, with a crisis, maybe that'll bring the country, people will get to come to their senses and establish a free society. Not necessarily. In a crisis, people look for the savior, for the man on the white horse, for the dictator who's going to save them. I mean, people were afraid. People were faced with the specter of starvation here in the United States. Imagine, you know, this breadbasket of all this great wealth and prosperity, and now all of a sudden people are like crossing the country in the Dust Bowl and so forth. People were scared. And unfortunately, and so they bought into this idea that free enterprise had failed. By this time, keep in mind that public schooling had been in existence for some 30 years now. And so people had acquired this mindset of regimentation and deference to authority and trust the government, trust officials. So they didn't think in terms of questioning the official version of things. So here was a man that said, I can get you out of this. And of course, after his first term, things got worse and worse. And then all of a sudden, the war clouds start forming in Europe, and Roosevelt's over there beating the war drums, even though he was telling the American people in his 1940 campaign, I will keep us out of foreign wars. The fact is that he was building up and provoking both the Germans and the Japanese, or later the Japanese in 41, to get into the war. And so people sense that hey, we're looking at another war. And so Roosevelt was like the leader. And unfortunately, that's what happens a lot of times in these crises, is that people look to the man on the white horse. That's why I think they turned to Roosevelt and stayed with him.
I'm glad you mentioned the Dust Bowl there. You know, I used to explain to people that, well, you know, the Great Depression was largely manufactured by the state, as you said, by Federal Reserve policy, et cetera. And then I would say, well, you know, there was still the Dust Bowl and there are other circumstances going on in the world that were kind of outside their control. But then, no, of course, I was wrong. The Dust Bowl was all the federal government's fault. And I read a great Murray Rothbard piece. Of course, it's Murray Rothbard, who went and showed that it was federal government policy restricting the size that ranches could be, and the ranch land in the Plains states. Basically, the mandate was that the ranch land has to be too small for any decent sized ranch to raise any real cattle. So then the alternative was to keep the fences open and make it one big commons. And so all the cattle grazers, with the same tragedy of the commons right out of the textbook, they grazed all of that grass right the hell to extinction, basically turned the whole thing to nothing but dirt. And it was because of government intervention in the market dictating the limits of the size of the plots of land that these ranchers were allowed to buy. And of course, all you got to do is type in Rothbard Dust Bowl. Just type in Rothbard, whatever your question is, and you get, oh, it was the government's fault in the first place. Of course, you can't even blame the weather on the weather. No, even the weather is the kind of national government's fault in this country, always.
Well, I've always suspected that, but that's a fascinating story, and it has a ring of logic to it. I mean, you had this ridiculous farm policy that was part of the New Deal, and it creates these perverse things. It's a funny thing you say that about the weather, though, because Leonard Read, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, who had an enormous impact on my getting into libertarianism. He once said that somebody commented about the bad weather, and he says that he never complained about bad weather because bad weather reminded him that at least this was one portion of his life that government still did not control.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that's true anymore.
Yeah. That's funny. All right, so I want to mention this to wrap up here. I'm stealing the premise for this from Just Raimondo's article for tomorrow at antiwar.com, but it's the 53rd anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis today. When the day that Kennedy gave the speech to the American people that we caught the Soviets red-handed putting nuclear missiles into Cuba, which was actually not a lie, which is amazing and newsworthy, noteworthy in and of itself. But then, I don't know, it's a story worth telling. I know that you're very interested in that story, and I know the audience is probably skews pretty young and probably don't know much about it. Even if they've seen 13 Days, they probably still don't know much about it. So you want to tell them real quick how close we all came to dying before we were born here?
Yeah, I really think we ought to have a whole show on this. I mean, I consider the Cuba situation and the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Kennedy assassination, it's all interweaved. One of the most fascinating parts of America. I mean, I used to be most fascinated by the Roosevelt Revolution, the Welfare State Revolution. Not anymore. To me, that kind of pales to the whole Cold War era. I mean, think about it. The United States always portrayed Cuba as the threat. This communist threat 90 miles away, and people were supposed to be scared and frightened, and we need more budgets for the military and the Pentagon and the CIA and so forth. Cuba never did anything to the United States. They never attacked. They never threatened to attack. They never had terrorist attacks. They never assassinated anybody over here. It was always the opposite. The U.S. invaded this country that had never invaded the United States without a declaration of war. I mean, the attack at the Bay of Pigs was really, in principle, no different from like the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. I mean, Cuba had never attacked the United States. Now, they tried to assassinate Castro. Why? Because Castro happened to have the wrong beliefs. He believed in socialism and communism, and they said, well, that entitles him, gives him a license to kill. Imagine. So when we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, we're talking about the Soviets who brought in missiles to Cuba. Now, why did they bring nuclear missiles? Why did they bring nuclear missiles into Cuba? To attack the United States, to serve as a staging ground for? No. I mean, if they had wanted to do that, they would have fired the missiles, because as it turned out, what the CIA didn't know is that these missiles were fully operational, and the Soviets had given battlefield authority to the Soviet commanders on the ground, that in case of an invasion, which the Pentagon and the CIA were demanding that Kennedy do, they had battlefield authority to fire the nuclear missiles in defense. Now, why did they put those missiles there? Well, because the Cubans, Fidel Castro, was certain that the Pentagon and the CIA were going to invade again, that Kennedy was going to send another invasion force. So the Cuban army knew it could never stand up to a full-scale invasion by the U.S. government. So they asked the Soviets to bring these missiles in as a deterrent. a deterrent against another war of aggression. And so at the height of this crisis, Kennedy is saying, look, let me try to figure out why the Soviets did this. And his Joint Chiefs of Staff are saying, nonsense, this is appeasement. They compared it to like Chamberlain's appeasement at Munich. And they said, a communist is a communist, invade. This is your chance to invade Cuba and win. Well, Kennedy said no, and he figured out why they had done this, because they were fearing another invasion. So he gives them a guarantee, we will not invade Cuba, and we will, by the way, remove our missiles out of Turkey that are aimed at you, right near your lands. And the Soviets said, okay. So they withdraw their missiles, and so that was the whole thing. It was the deterrent effect of this as compared to an act of aggression by the Soviets that we've always taught it was. Now, why we ought to discuss this in another program is that this was the major shift in Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, as well as Nikita Khrushchev. A dramatic shift in their mindsets, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, because they both knew they had come to the very edge of all-out nuclear war that probably would have wiped out humanity. And that had a searing effect on both men, which caused both of them to say, let's end the Cold War now. It's time for just peaceful coexistence. We may disagree on our philosophy, communism, capitalism, and so forth, but there's no reason why we can't get along. And that, of course, then leads to the whole idea of the Kennedy assassination, what Kennedy was doing during this period of time, and so forth. Absolutely fascinating period.
All right, cool. Well, so let's do that next time then.
I'd love to. That'd be fantastic.
Okay, great. Well, that's Jacob Hornberger, everybody. He is the founder and the president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and that's why this show is called The Future of Freedom. Thanks very much, Jacob. See you next Thursday.
Oh, thank you, Scott. I always have a great time with you. Enjoyed the show
again. Thanks,
again.
everybody, for watching. Really appreciate it.